Hi, my name is Mark Singer, and I'm the Mayo Professor of Social Work at the Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. My interest in violence exposure began some 45 years ago while working at the Detention Center for Boys in Brooklyn, New York. One of the things I noticed was the behaviors of these young men were the same behaviors I saw in my friends who were returning from Vietnam. These included sleeping problems, explosive behaviors and impulse control, interpersonal difficulties, especially with trust and closeness, and substance abuse. And I realized that the one thing they had in common was exposure to violence. So today, I want to talk about what I've learned over those 45 years. I'd like to begin by reviewing the learning objectives of this talk, to become familiar with statistics and consequences of violence exposure, to understand coping mechanisms and the impact of alcohol and other drugs used for coping, to learn about violence in the brain, and to introduce the concept of adolescent problem clusters. We're going to be reviewing several interacting concepts. First, of course, is exposure to violence, and this exposure is either as a victim or a witness. Then we're going to talk about trauma symptoms, violent and aggressive behavior, and alcohol and drug misuse. It's tempting to see these concepts in a very straightforward causal process. Violence exposure leads to trauma symptoms, which leads to violent behavior, which then can lead to alcohol and drug misuse. But in reality, it's not quite that simple. These are really interacting concepts that play off of one another, and it's not as straightforward as we'd like to think. So we'll begin by talking about some national statistics in terms of violence exposure and violent behaviors. This first slide is really about the types and rates of child victimization. And what I want you to notice is that the lowest rate of victimization is homicide. Why is it the lowest rate? Well, basically, you can only become a homicide victim once in your life. The highest rate is sibling assault. And sibling assault is something that's really not well appreciated by individuals working with young people, and they don't really realize the magnitude of the problem in terms of sibling assault. It's also something that is not well researched. So sibling assault really is the most frequent in terms of the chart. This next chart talks about individuals 12 to 17 years of age as well as other ages, but the learning piece is the 12 to 17 years. And what I want you to notice is that in terms of almost every type of victimization, the 12 to 17-year-olds are overrepresented. So this is a time in one's life that they are very likely to be victimized. It's another way of looking at it, adolescents versus adults in terms of victimization rates of some very specific types of crime. So when we look at assault, for example, we see that an assault is about 3 times higher for individuals 11 to 19 years than adults. The next, robbery, is about 2 times higher for adolescents than adults. Rape, about 3 times higher. And homicide, being a victim of a homicide, it's about equal. This is relatively good news for older people, and there's not a lot of good news about growing old, but this chart certainly shows one piece of good news, and that is, as you can see, as you progress in age, your odds of being a victim of a violent crime go down. And for individuals who are 65 and over, it's really at a relatively low level compared to younger people. However, every silver lining has a cloud. And this cloud is that suicide rates, when you look at them compared to homicide rates in the United States, go up for people who are older, particularly 75 years of age and up. And so you can see that those people at that age group are more at risk for suicide than homicide. And the reverse is true really at the younger end. So until their teenage years, who is more likely to be murdered in the United States? Girls or boys? Actually, it's somewhat of a trick question because they're almost equal as likely until about 12 to 12 and a half. And at that age, as you can see, boys skyrocket and really have a much higher likelihood of being murdered. So why is this? Actually, there are at least 3 reasons, and I'm sure more. One is that one of the tasks of adolescence is to move away from parents and family and towards peer groups. So they're much less supervised, they're out of the house usually more often, and more often with younger people. The next for boys is hormones, testosterone. At about 12 to 13 years old, that's when the hormones for boys kick in. And then last but not least in the 3 things that I'm going to be reviewing is the male role in the United States. And in the United States, to be a man, as if you watch movies, etc., you need to be tough. You need to be able to to fight, to protect yourself, and also be able to use guns. And access to guns for boys starting at 12 also increases. Next, what I'd like to look at is juvenile homicide in terms of victims by firearm or when there is no firearm. And one of the things that's very impressive about this, and if you may remember, starting in the 90s, the homicide rate of juveniles really increased. And this chart is kind of one-stop shopping in terms of why did it increase. So when you look at no firearm involved, what you end up seeing is almost a straight line from 1980 all the way to 2006. But the huge increase that occurred in the 90s was almost entirely firearm related. And so we see that guns and young people really don't mix. So I'd also like to talk a little bit about some what I think are erroneous beliefs in terms of young people and firearms. Some people believe that children can be taught to use guns safely. And what I'd like to talk a little bit about is some of the other things we try to teach young people, for example, Safety Town. And Safety Town, for those of you that are familiar with it, really is for preschool children or kindergarten children, and it teaches them to do several things that they may not learn otherwise, and one is crossing the street safely. So street safety. But who of us would believe that after a young person who's in preschool or kindergarten went through Safety Town that they could cross a busy New York street? Highly unlikely. Why? Because developmentally, while we're beginning a learning, it's probably not complete until they're about 9 years old. Crossing a busy street is very complex. Some people also believe that in-depth education can teach people to use firearms, young people, to use firearms safely. And what I'd like to kind of give you with that is an analogy in terms of prescription drugs. And we know that the biggest abusers, professional abusers of prescription drugs are pharmacists, nurses, physicians, dentists. These are the individuals that have the most education in terms of the harms that these drugs can cause. But these are individuals that also have the most access to these drugs. So simply put, knowledge plus access does not equal safety. So this is for a very highly educated professional group of individuals. I would say to you that the same holds true for youngsters in terms of their safe use of guns. This chart talks about homicide offending by age, and one of the take-home lessons here, and what I want you to notice, is the highest offending is from 18 to 24 years of age. And a couple of interesting things about this age group of people. First of all, they are transitioning from being an adolescent or childhood into adulthood. And so somehow, the minute you hit your 18th birthday, you switch from being a child or adolescent and you become an adult on that day. So you're moved from juvenile court to adult court. You often have to have adult mental health services if you were receiving child mental health services. And yet what's really interesting is there's nothing magical that happens on that day. Nothing at all. But this switch takes place. We're now recognizing the importance of this, and some services are really being carried out through age 21. One of the things that we know about brain development is that the brain continues to develop into the mid-20s. And so this is very important for this age group, and particularly boys in this age group. What we know is that the prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to develop, and so it really isn't developed fully until the mid-20s. This part of the brain controls impulses, judgment, focusing of attention, and inhibiting of inappropriate behaviors. This chart deals with what occurs at certain hours in terms of juvenile crime. And as you can see on school days, 3 to 7, 3 in the afternoon until 7 at night, are very high-risk times for juvenile violent crime. Why? Basically, what ends up happening is that these youngsters leave school and there's no adult present. And so they hang out with other youngsters and there's really no adult supervision. One of the other interesting things is that between these hours from 3 to 7, studies have shown that there's an increased likelihood of becoming pregnant. No one's at home. Let's go to my house and hang out. We were fortunate enough several years ago to try out a little experiment in Cleveland through getting a Safe Schools and Healthy Children grant. And what this grant was for was to be able to have assist teams at schools and in the neighborhoods when individuals were let out of school. And the assist team was a police officer and either a guidance counselor or a coach simply walking around the neighborhood. And this resulted in a 29% decrease in calls for service. So certainly it's important to recognize what can be done in those hours from 3 to 7. Now, some people think that students are a lot safer away from school than at school. And for the most part, particularly in terms of serious violent crimes, this is not true. Students are generally not safer in their neighborhoods or homes than they are at schools. But one of the reasons for this perception is the witnessing of violence at school. For example, if two youngsters end up having a fight in the lunchroom and someone yells "fight," do you think that students run out of the lunchroom and away from the fight, or do students run to the fight in order to see it? And of course, it's the latter. And those students that saw the fight go home, they tell their parents, they tell their friends about what they saw. And so while you've had one fight, you may have 700 people that learned about it in the and witnessed. And well, with a small number of students witnessing it, it blows out to about 700 people hearing about it. Homicides in schools have actually really decreased over time. And as you can see, this graphically shows, and particularly 2008, 2009, very low levels. So with respect to homicide, you're really much safer in school than you are in your neighborhood or at home. So let's talk about some of the consequences of violence exposure. In that same study that we've been discussing of about 3,000 adolescent high school students, one of the things that we did with the students is to have them complete a questionnaire on their level of violence exposure. We also had them complete something called the Trauma Symptom Checklist for Children, which really looks at trauma symptoms related to violence exposure. What this chart shows is we looked at the 25% least violence-exposed girls and boys and compared them to the 25% most violent-exposed boys and girls with respect to their scores on the trauma symptom checklist for children. And we looked at clinical levels of these scores. By a clinical level, what we mean is a level that if you score that high, then you need either a further evaluation or you need some type of intervention. And as you can see, what we found is that on every single subscale of the trauma symptom checklist, youngsters who were exposed to a lot of violence were significantly higher in terms of their clinical scores. And then when you look at those who scored one or more scores in the clinical range for both boys and girls, you could see it's almost uncanny. Just about 29–30% of each who were high violence exposed scored in that range. So we can conclude in terms of some of the consequences of violence exposure, and there's certainly more, but depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, dissociation, anger, and violent behaviors are among the most important consequences. So when young people have exposure to violence, what is a fast and very reliable way to deal with the emotional consequences of this exposure to violence? Alcohol and other drugs. Why? Basically, when you take alcohol or other drugs, the alcohol or drug can help you feel less depressed, feel less inhibited, be friends with other users. You can get a natural peer group. Helps you relax, feel better about your problems, and it can also help you feel a lot more energetic. Many other feelings as well. So we asked young people who were violence exposed, what ways do you use to dealing with being upset? This is now the obligatory slide that will let you know that you're in an academic lecture because it's unreadable. It's way too busy. But let me give you the story behind the slide. We also asked young people what types of violent behaviors they committed, and we had a scale for violent behaviors. We took youngsters who scored in the top 10% on that violent behavior scale and compared them to all the rest of the other youngsters and asked each group what they do to cope when they're upset. And as you can see, the coping strategy used by the more violent youth significantly differed from the other youth. So more violent youths get angry and yell to cope. They say something mean to people to cope, and they use alcohol and drugs. Well, needless to say, these three ways of coping is not going to help them calm down, and it's not going to help the people that they're dealing with feel any better about them. The most frequently endorsed coping strategy, by the way, for all young people, whether they were high violence exposed or not, both boys and girls, was listening to music. The least frequently endorsed coping strategy was talking with a teacher, minister, or counselor. And you can see very low percentages of youngsters, either violence exposed or not, endorse that as something that they would do in order to cope. This simply means, obviously, you can't hang a shingle out and expect youngsters to come to you who have been violence exposed. You really need to seek these youngsters out. This chart actually, I think, very graphically talks about youngsters who are 12 to 17 years of age who have been engaged in violent behaviors and how many illicit drugs they self-reported using. And so as you can see here, the more numbers of illicit drugs that youngsters reported using, the higher their violent behaviors were over the past year. Well, this leads us to really trying to understand what goes on behind this violence exposure in terms of young people's thinking and behavior. And a really interesting and well-researched theory, social information processing theory, helps us to understand how violent youngsters differ from youngsters who are not violent, how youngsters who've been exposed to a lot of violence differ from youngsters who have not been exposed to as much violence. So one of the things that social information processing theory tells us is that individuals who have been exposed to a lot of violence have cognitive distortions. That is, they don't process social interactions the same as youngsters who've been exposed to less violence. What are these cognitive distortions? One is that they interpret ambiguous acts as potentially threatening to them. So if they don't understand something that you're doing or that's going on, they see that as a potential threat, much more than youngsters who've not been exposed to a lot of violence. Another cognitive distortion is that they really look for hostility in people and kind of try to seek out something that they feel might be hostile or threatening that that person is doing. And there's also a poor fund of potential resources or potential responses for children who've been exposed to a lot of violence compared to other children. Basically, they're potential resources and responses, fight or flight. They don't have a lot of other ways that they deal with being upset. And last, social information processing theory tells us that these youngsters have poor impulse control. They really can't rest very long with ambiguity. They need to act rather than just stay still and think. So let's talk a little bit about violence exposure in the brain, because this is really what we've been able to do is through the advance of science, we've been able to show that social information processing theory really has a lot of currency with respect to what we know about the brain. So, as some of you may have heard of a term called the amygdala, which really is the fight-flight center of the brain. It's a very primitive center in the brain, and you can see here its location. We used to think that the amygdala was not in control of behavior, that the prefrontal cortex would receive impulses from the amygdala and then be able to decide whether or not a person was going to act on that. But what we now know is that this is not true. As you can see in this diagram, the sensory data is sent to the thalamus. It's also sent to the amygdala and sent, as you can see in number 3, to the cortex. The amygdala does a quick threat assessment, and the amygdala can block the slow-thinking cortex, and what can happen is you can have an immediate response that was not reviewed by the cortex, what we might call an unthinking response. I want to give you a couple of examples of that. So one example certainly is in wartime. You really don't have time to think about, gee, is the sound of that shell incoming or outgoing? Okay, you basically hit the dirt when you hear the sound. If you were to do a slow think on it, you may end up not being alive much longer to think the next day. A real-life example I'd like to share with you, with one of my friends who came back from Vietnam, came to visit me shortly after we returned to the States. And we were sitting in my living room, and I remember very well, it was the 3rd of July. And we all know what happens on the 3rd and the 4th of July. All kinds of fireworks go off. We're watching a television show, and some firecrackers went off, and my friend hit the ground and really tried to go under the couch that we were sitting on. He was very embarrassed. He got up. He said, wow, I'm sorry. I'm just, stateside only a brief period of time. I won't do this again. So we began watching the show, and a couple of other times when the firecrackers went off, excuse me, he ended up being fine. Then he lost himself in the show. Firecrackers went off, hit the ground. So we ended up having to turn the television off. Eventually, this behavior was extinguished, but it's a really good example of the threat assessment occurring and a behavior happening even though he didn't want to. It didn't get review from his cortex. Now, in Vietnam, this behavior saved his life. In the States, this behavior is embarrassing. So when your amygdala is activated, it really is similar to you being on your own body's drugs. Okay, so a violent event or a stressful event occurs and your stress system is activated. Powerful neurochemicals are released. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol, and they're released throughout the body and the brain. This allows you to activate and become more successful in a fight or flight response. So what physically happens to you when you're in a highly threatening or scary situation? There are a lot of bodily effects in terms of these stress drugs. You have increased heart rate, increased blood flow to the muscles, decreased blood flow to the skin and your gut. The liver produces extra glucose to fuel your ability to act and respond, and your vigilance and arousal and attention to your brain becomes very, very focused. Actually, in terms of this, there's a predisposition once this stress system is activated for you to act. And interestingly, some people really become, they enjoy their own stress drugs. We have a name for these individuals, and they're called action junkies. And they're really addicted to the rush of their own body's threat systems and to their own neurochemicals. So your body's drugs are very protective in the short run. However, in the long run, overuse can cause physical and emotional problems both in children and in adults. So in adults, some of the problems that can be caused are cardiovascular problems, such as high blood pressure, heart disease, heart attack, stroke, increased susceptibility to infections and diseases, and diabetes due to increased cortisol production, increased susceptibility to the ulcers and the digestive disorders due to restricted blood flow to your stomach. Certainly mental health problems such as depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, marital and family problems, violent behaviors, and substance abuse problems. In children and adolescents, we think really of hypervigilance, emotional problems, as we talked about earlier, alcohol and drug use, problems with trust, problems with concentration, and difficulty with emotional regulation and impulse control. I'd like to give you a very powerful clinical example of what we've just talked about with respect to the brain. And I'm going to show you a brief clip of a young man, and then I'm going to make some observations after this clip. But what I want you to think about when you see this clip is what is occurring in this young man's brain, and what is he telling you about in terms of his own brain's functioning. So here's the clinical example.
I hate child abusers. I hate child molesters. There's a burning in my heart that just wants to break loose and just kill people like that. They just don't know, they don't understand what kids have to go through. I mean, I see it around me in this place, this sick place, kids that have been beaten and abused, and they don't even have the mentality to understand anything. They're just wasted away, gone, diminished, nothing's left. A lot of my childhood revolves around my mother. She was very spontaneous and violent. I remember one time I went up to my mother and I asked her what this certain curse word was. And she had just gone totally berserk, and she dragged me into my room. I was only 5 years old then. And she sat on top of me and just pounding on my face, just pounding on my neck and chest, just from here up, just pounding and pounding until I was black and blue, couldn't even see. And that wasn't so bad, that wasn't so strange, so odd about my mother, okay, doing something like that. I could accept that, I had to accept that. But the thing that was very peculiar, okay, was my mother brought another friend across the street from us and had that lady beat on me, you know. Sadistic, that's the word I'm looking for. She was very sadistic. And to this day, even when I think about those memories, I just hate her, you know. She's the type of woman that somebody would fantasize about just thrashing, you know, just like biting into her neck and just ripping her throat out. You know, I don't even like thinking about her. That's how much I hate her.
Donald came into the CYA, I guess the last 5 years. And what he did was to vandalize, to destroy schools and homes, cars.
And somehow me and this kid hooked up together when we were in junior high. One day he had told me, he said, hey, you want to do a burglary? You want to go rip off a house? Yeah, sure, let's go. You know? So we waited nighttime and went to somebody's house when they were home, and you know, I got this urge just to like tear something up. So I just went to the kitchen, took the skillet, busted out this oven window, you know, and just going off in there, just tearing things up, going through the rooms, just breaking windows, breaking cabinet doors, smashing TVs, stereos, just ransacking the whole house.
Anything that seemed to be of value and seemed to reflect the positive or the good in others was the target for him to attack and destroy.
I knew I would never touch my mother, so I just took it out by destroying things, being very destructive. I would steal cars, run them off cliffs, roll them, just do crazy things in them, smash them up. And then I started on people. First it was teachers, spitting in their faces, broke a bench over this one coach's head, cut up this one kid with a broken bottle, just a dirty, low-down pig. That's what I was becoming.
How are you going to handle it then? Donald, you want to pretend to be his father. Say, hey, man, what do you do with your life?
Juan, what are you gonna do with your life, man? Gonna sit here and act like a f***ing bum? Ain't gonna do nothing? Ain't gonna school yourself? It's gonna be another nobody, another wino on the streets.
I don't even want to talk about him. I don't even want to hear about it.
You can't hide from facts, man. The man's your father. He's going to show up. He's the most important person in your life, whether
He ain't
you
no
like
fact,
it or not.
huh?
He is a fact.
He ain't no fact.
Do you want to erase him?
I already did.
Yeah? With what? A spray can? You go, psh,
Everything.
I wipe you out?
My whole brain.
In your brains, huh?
My whole imagination.
Every time somebody puts you down, you see your father yelling at you. It's very hard to live with the constant image of the past destructive force on oneself. They're constantly reminded not so much of the events themselves as the feelings that those events stirred up in them. The past returns to them in the form of an image of themselves as defeated or humiliated or assaulted, and they can't get away from it. It's constantly there. We can rub out very slowly and gradually some experiences, and I prefer to use a repetitious and slow pattern than trying to do something magically and erasing the past.
I know inside I have the potential to be a child beater. I heard a baby crying a ways back, you know, here at visiting, and that baby crying just kind of just got on my nerves and just drove me crazy to where just like, shut up, kid, you know? And that's how my mother used to do, shut up, kid, and just slap the shit out of you, you know? Oh, I'm tripping on this. But I don't think I can ever have kids because of her. I don't think I could ever raise a child or children. It's a damn shame.
So what I want you to think about in terms of the clinical example you just saw is some of the things that Donald was saying. So first, did you find him believable in terms of being honest? And I can just tell you I did. I thought that he was very honest with how he experienced things. I also think that he was very motivated to change his behaviors and didn't want to hurt young people or do the things to others that happened to him. He also was pretty insightful, I thought. and really understood some of the things that made him behave the way he behaved. But here's the interesting question. Does that honesty and insight and motivation assure you that Donald's behaviors will be in control once he's released? So if he's released next week, would you feel comfortable in Donald moving in and living next door to you? One of the things that I would submit is that through his own statements, he believes that he may not be in control of his own behaviors, even though he wants to be. And so this really is an interesting lesson about the amygdala and the amygdala overriding the thinking brain. So what I'd like to talk about next really is adolescent problem clusters. And one of the things that's very important in dealing with adolescents is realizing that adolescents often don't have a single problem, or right now what we're talking about very frequently is dual disorders, one or two problems. But I like to think of it really as adolescent problem clusters, that many things can be found in one adolescent, many different types of problems if you look for them. So what are they? Alcohol and drug abuse, mental and emotional disorders, physical, sexual abuse, low self-esteem problems, suicidal ideation or acts, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, learning disabilities, violence exposure, violent behavior and impulse control problems, head injuries and accidents, and that's something, by the way, that often is not asked about. But individuals who've experienced head injuries or accidents, first of all, cannot use alcohol and drugs, or shouldn't be using them, because they really need the full power of their brain just in order to keep their behaviors in control. And then last, inappropriate sexual activity or prostitution in terms of these problem clusters. So in conclusion, children and adolescents should be screened for violence exposure. Violence exposure is related to a number of other potential areas of clinical concern. In many youth, problems tend to come in clusters, and the ability to screen for multiple issues is very important. The earlier the identification, the better. If someone had identified Donald at age 6, we probably wouldn't be seeing him in the manner that we did much later at age 17. So early identification is the key. I'd like to thank you very much for being a guest at this presentation.